The mist was so thick you could taste it. Caleb reined in his horse, the creak of leather loud in the dead quiet of dawn. He wasn't a man who spooked easy, but something was wrong. It was a feeling in the air, a stillness that wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. Then he heard it, a sound so thin it was almost lost in the grey light. A cry. Not an animal. A child. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the wet earth. He didn't bother tying his horse. Old Jasper knew to stay put. He moved toward the sound, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife he always carried. Not for trouble, just for work. But this morning it felt different. The sound came again from a hollowed-out cottonwood just ahead, a dark mouth in the pale field. A small face, streaked with dirt and terror, peeked out for a second, then vanished. Caleb crouched low. "Easy there," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I ain't gonna hurt you." He wasn't good with words, especially with folks, but he knew how to soothe a spooked horse, and this felt a lot like that. Two little girls were huddled inside, pressed together so tight they looked like one shivering creature. The older one, maybe 7 or 8, clutched a raggedy doll and stared at him with eyes that had seen too much. The little one had tear tracks, cutting clean lines through the grime on her cheeks. "Mama's hurt," the older one said, her voice surprisingly steady. Then her face crumpled, and the words came out in a choked whisper. "Mama's dying." And just like that, Caleb's world shifted. He was a man who mended fences, who checked on cattle, who lived his life on the edge of other people's trouble. He never stepped in. It wasn't his way, but looking at these two scraps of life, he knew he couldn't just ride on. He couldn't leave them here for whatever came next. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice rough. The girl pointed with a trembling finger toward a stand of trees near the ravine. Caleb saw it then, a wagon lying on its side like a dead beast, one wheel snapped clean off. It wasn't just a wreck. It looked like it had been torn apart, splintered wood everywhere, supplies scattered across the grass. And the smell, the bitter metallic smell of blood. This wasn't an accident. He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This was something else entirely. He reached a big, calloused hand toward them. "Come on," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Let's go see to your mama." The older one didn't hesitate. She took his hand, her small fingers gripping his with a strength that surprised him. He lifted her out, then the little one, and swung them both up onto his horse. He mounted behind them, their small, stiff bodies a strange weight against him. He rode slow, letting the sound of his voice fill the empty morning, not asking questions, just murmuring nonsense about the weather and the color of the sky. But his eyes were scanning the tree line, searching for shadows that didn't belong. He found her half pinned under the wagon, one hand stretched out like she'd been reaching for her children as it all went wrong. Her eyes fluttered open when his shadow fell across her. "The girls," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "They're safe," Caleb said, his voice tight, "right here with me." The woman's shoulders relaxed just a fraction. He saw the wound then, a deep, ugly gash along her side, bleeding sluggishly. His stomach clenched. She was pale, her hair damp with sweat, but her gaze was locked on her daughters, drinking them in. "You have to take them," she rasped, a sudden fire in her eyes. "Get them away from here. He's coming." Caleb's blood ran cold. He's coming, not something happened. Not we crashed, but he's coming. "Who's coming?" Caleb asked, kneeling beside her. She shook her head, her eyes wide with a terror that went far beyond a simple wagon wreck. "No time," she whispered, grabbing his sleeve with surprising strength. "Promise me. Promise you'll keep them safe." Caleb looked from her desperate face to the two little girls huddled by the horse, their silence more terrifying than any scream. He pulled off his bandana and pressed it to the wound. "I'll get you all out," he said, his voice firm. "There's a doctor in town." "No," she insisted, her voice getting weaker. "Just the girls. He won't stop." Caleb tore a strip from his own shirt, his mind racing. This was more than trouble. This was a hunt, and he had just stepped right into the middle of it. He tied the makeshift bandage tight, his big hands gentle. Then he slid his arms under her, lifting her as if she were made of glass. She was light, too light, like life was already slipping away. He carried her to the horse, mounted behind his small passengers, and settled her across his lap. The sun was burning the mist away now, and the world looked sharp and unforgiving. He set his jaw. He didn't know who he was, but he knew one thing. They wouldn't get these girls. Not while he was still breathing. He nudged the horse forward, away from the broken wagon and the silent watching trees. He was riding into town with a dying woman and 2 orphans, and a promise he had no idea how to keep. The trouble he'd spent his whole life avoiding had finally found him, and it had a name he didn't even know. The horse's hooves pounded a frantic rhythm against the hard-packed earth. Each jolt sent a ripple of pain across the woman's face. Caleb tightened his grip, trying to shield her from the punishing ride, but he couldn't slow down. Not now. The girls clung to the saddle horn, their small bodies rigid. The woman Ellen stirred in his arms, her breath a shallow flutter against his chest. "You don't have to save me," she whispered, her voice so faint he had to lean down to hear it. "Just them." "I ain't leaving anyone to die out here," he growled, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. He'd seen men die. He'd put down animals with broken legs. But he'd never held a life so fragile, never felt the weight of 2 children's futures pressing down on him. The town was still miles away, a shimmer of heat on the horizon. The beauty of the open prairie felt like a mockery, too peaceful for the desperate race he was running against time and against the man she called he. He caught the older girl's eye. He gave a single sharp nod. A promise without words. "I'll get you through this." By the time they reached the river crossing, her lips were turning blue. He slid from the saddle, leaving the girls mounted. He checked the bandage. It was soaked through. Red. Too much red. Cursing under his breath, he ripped another strip from his ruined shirt and pressed it hard against the wound. She gasped, her eyes flying open. "My name's Ellen," she breathed, as if she needed him to know it before the end. "Caleb," he said, his hands working quickly. "You hold on, Ellen." She tried to smile, but it was a grimace of pain. "You have kind hands, Caleb," she whispered, and then her eyes rolled back. He didn't know what to say to that. His hands were scarred, calloused, made for hauling rope and breaking horses. They weren't kind, but he tied the new bandage with a strange gentleness, then swung back into the saddle, pulling her tight against him. The first buildings of the town came into view, and it was a double-edged sword. Relief because the doctor was there, but dread because he knew what else was there. Questions, whispers, and trouble. Folks in this town didn't like strangers, especially strangers who showed up covered in blood. As he rode down the main street, the town went quiet. Heads turned. A ranch hand leaning against a post at the feed store slowly straightened, his eyes narrowing to slits. 2 women stopped mid-sentence, their gazes flicking from Caleb to the bleeding woman to the terrified girls. He ignored them all, his jaw set like granite. He pulled up in front of the doctor's office and dismounted in one fluid motion. He handed the reins to the older girl. "Hold him steady," he ordered. She nodded, her small face a mask of grim determination. He carried Ellen inside, his boots thudding on the wooden floor. The air smelled of carbolic acid and something else. Fear. The doctor, a wiry man with spectacles, looked up from his ledger. His eyes widened. "Good Lord, son, put her here." Caleb laid her gently on the cot. The doctor cut away the bloody bandage, and his face went grim. "This wasn't a wagon wreck," he said, his voice low. "This looks like a knife." Caleb's blood went cold. A knife. Ellen hadn't just been hurt in a crash, she'd been attacked. "You should have gotten here sooner," the doctor grunted. "Found her less than an hour ago," Caleb bit out, his fists clenching at his sides. He felt useless, a bull in a china shop, as the doctor worked to save her. He glanced out the window. The girls were sitting on the steps, pressed together like 2 little birds in a storm. Their presence was a physical blow. He stepped outside and crouched in front of them. "He's fixing her up," he said, his voice quiet. The younger one looked at him, her eyes huge. "She won't die." He wanted to promise her. He wanted to say the words. But he couldn't lie to her. Not now. He laid a hand on her shoulder. "Not if I can help it." He went back inside. The doctor looked up, his face slick with sweat. "She's lost a lot of blood. If she makes it through the night, she's got a chance, a slim one." Caleb's chest felt like it was in a vice. Night was hours away. He sank into a chair, the weight of it all crashing down on him. He had brought them here for help, but as he looked out the window again, he saw him. The ranch hand from the feed store. He wasn't at the feed store anymore. He was standing across the street, just watching the doctor's office. Watching and waiting. And Caleb knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the man Ellen was running from was already here. Or at least his friends were. The fight wasn't over. It had just followed them to town. The sun bled out of the sky, painting the street in shades of orange and purple. The doctor finally stepped back from the cot, wiping his bloody hands on a rag. His face was drawn. "I've done what I can," he said, his voice flat with exhaustion. "Now we wait." Caleb nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Ellen lay unnervingly still, her breathing so shallow he had to strain to see the rise and fall of her chest. He pushed open the door and stepped onto the porch, the cooler evening air a small relief. The girls were still there, huddled on the top step. The younger one had cried herself to sleep in her sister's lap. "She's holding on," he told the older one softly. The girl just nodded, her eyes never leaving his face, as if she was trying to read the future there. Down the street, the saloon doors swung open, spilling yellow light and rough laughter onto the boardwalk. The whispers started then, slithering through the dusk. "Trouble follows men like Hart," one voice muttered, loud enough to carry, "bringing that woman here." Foolish. Caleb's neck prickled. Hart. So that was his name. Caleb had spent his life keeping his head down, avoiding the kind of trouble that came with names. When the saloon door creaked open again, a broad-shouldered man leaned against the frame. It was the ranch hand from the feed store. His eyes locked onto Caleb. "Hart," he drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Didn't know you'd taken to hauling in strays." Caleb rose slowly, letting his height and the quiet menace he'd learned long ago do the talking. "Just seeing to folks who need it," he said, his voice dangerously even. The man, Hart, gave a short, ugly laugh, then disappeared back into the saloon. The door swung shut, but the threat lingered in the air like poison. A few minutes later, the blacksmith's wife scurried by. She didn't look at him, but she set a small basket on the step beside the girls. Inside was a loaf of bread, still warm. She gave Caleb a quick, almost fearful nod, then hurried away. It was a small kindness in a town that was quickly turning hostile. It was a sign that not everyone here was on Hart's side. The girls woke and tore the bread, offering him a piece. He ate it slowly, the taste of ash on his tongue. He wasn't just hungry, he was sizing up the battlefield. As night fell, the town grew quiet, but it was a tense, listening quiet. Every sound was sharp, the jingle of spurs, a dog barking, a door slamming shut. Caleb sat on the porch, a scrap of wood and his whittling knife in his hands. He started carving, the familiar motion calming the storm inside him. He worked the wood into the rough shape of a horse, the shavings falling like pale snow at his feet. The older girl watched, her curiosity a small light in the darkness. The little one, still half asleep, climbed into his lap without asking. She was small and warm, and the trust in that simple act hit him harder than any fist. Near midnight, the doctor came out, his face grim in the lamplight. "She's still with us," he said, "but the fever's setting in. Keep it quiet." Caleb gently set the sleeping child beside her sister and stepped back into the clinic. The air was thick with the smell of sickness. Ellen was shivering, her eyes half open and glazed with fever. "The girls," she mumbled, her voice slurred. "Outside, they're safe," he said, pulling the chair closer to the cot. Her lips curved into a faint, pained smile. "You stayed." He looked at her, at this woman he'd met only that morning, and felt the truth of her words settle over him like a heavy blanket. "Wasn't going to leave you." Her hand twitched on the blanket, a weak, aborted gesture to reach for his. He watched her slip back into the fever dream, his jaw tight. He was a man who solved problems with his hands, with fences and horses, but this was different. He couldn't fix this with wire or rope. He heard a noise outside, a soft scraping sound at the back of the clinic. He was on his feet in an instant, his knife in his hand, moving with a speed and silence that would have surprised anyone who thought he was just a simple rancher. He slipped out the back door into the alley. A shadow detached itself from the wall. It was Hart. And he wasn't alone. There were two other men with him, their faces lost in the darkness. "The doctor's closed for the night," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. Hart chuckled. "We ain't here for the doctor. We're here for what you brought in, the woman and the girls." Caleb didn't move, but every muscle in his body was coiled tight. He had hoped he was wrong, but now he knew. The crash wasn't an accident, the wound wasn't from a fall, and the man Ellen was running from had found her. He was standing right here, in this dark alley, and the only thing between him and those little girls was Caleb. The night was just beginning. "You need to walk away from this, old man," Hart sneered, taking a step forward. The two men with him fanned out, trying to circle around. "This don't concern you." Caleb didn't flinch, he just held the other man's gaze. "It concerns me now," he said, his voice flat and cold. He could feel the weight of the two sleeping girls on the porch, the sound of Ellen's feverish breathing from inside. This wasn't just a fight, this was a line in the sand. Hart laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Your funeral." He lunged. Caleb moved with a speed that defied his size. He didn't go for Hart. He went for the man on his left, stepping inside the man's clumsy swing and driving the handle of his knife hard into his gut. The man doubled over with a grunt. Caleb spun, bringing his elbow up and catching the second man square on the jaw. There was a sickening crack, and the man went down like a sack of grain. Hart stopped dead, his eyes wide with surprise. He hadn't expected a fight. He'd expected an easy win against some dirt-poor rancher. He was wrong. "Who the hell are you?" Hart snarled, pulling a long, wicked-looking blade from his belt. Caleb just looked at him, the whittling knife held loose in his hand. It wasn't a fighting knife, but in his hands it was deadly. "I'm the man who's telling you to get out of this town and never come back," Caleb said. He wasn't just a rancher. The way he stood, the way he moved, the cold, hard look in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had seen violence before, who knew it intimately. From inside the clinic, a lamp flared to life. The doctor stood in the doorway, a double-barreled shotgun held steady in his hands. "I suggest you listen to him, Mr. Hart," the doctor said, his voice shaking only slightly. "My practice is closed for the night." Hart's eyes flicked from Caleb to the shotgun and back again. He was outnumbered, for now. He spat on the ground. "This ain't over," he hissed, backing away into the darkness. "Larson wants what's his, and he always gets it." He helped his groaning men to their feet, and they melted into the shadows. Larson. Another name, the man Ellen was so terrified of. Caleb stood there for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The adrenaline slowly faded, leaving behind a cold dread. He hadn't just won a fight. He had declared a war. He went back inside. The doctor was reloading the shotgun. "You handle yourself pretty well for a rancher," the doctor said, not looking at him. "Had some practice," Caleb said, his voice tight. He walked over to the cot. Ellen was tossing and turning, muttering in her sleep. "Larson, no, not the girls." He reached out and gently wiped her brow with a cool cloth. "He's not getting them," Caleb whispered, as much to himself as to her. "I swear it." The first hint of dawn found Caleb still sitting in the chair, the shotgun across his lap. He hadn't slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind had him on edge. The fever had broken just before sunrise, and Ellen was finally sleeping peacefully. The doctor had given him a grim look. "She's alive, for now, but that man, Larson, he owns this county, the sheriff, the judge. They're all in his pocket. Hart will be back, and he'll bring more men." Caleb nodded. He knew. He pushed himself to his feet and went out onto the porch. The girls were awake, watching the sun come up. "Is Mama better?" the little one asked, her voice small. "She is," Caleb said, managing a small smile. "She's resting." He knew what he had to do. He couldn't stay here. The clinic was a trap. He saddled his horse, his mind working. He needed a place to hide them, a place Larson's men wouldn't think to look. His own ranch was too obvious. He needed somewhere else. He walked over to the blacksmith shop. The smith was already at work, the ring of his hammer echoing in the morning air. The smith's wife, the one who had brought them bread, came out of the house. She looked at Caleb, her eyes full of fear. "You should leave," she whispered. "Take them and run." I can't run far enough, Caleb said. Larson will find them. I need a place to hold up, just for a few days, until she's strong enough to travel. The woman hesitated, glancing back at her husband. Then she seemed to make a decision. There's an old line shack, up in the high country, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Belonged to my father. No one's been up there in years. It's not much, but it's hidden. Caleb looked at her, seeing the courage in her eyes. She was risking everything to help them. Thank you, he said. He went back to the clinic. The doctor helped him get Ellen into a wagon he'd borrowed from the livery stable. He wrapped her in blankets, trying to make her as comfortable as possible. The girls climbed in beside her, their faces pale but determined. As they rolled out of town, he saw Hart and his men watching from the saloon. Their faces were bruised and swollen, their eyes full of hate. They didn't make a move. They were waiting. They knew he couldn't run forever. The road to the high country was rough, the wagon jolting over rocks and ruts. With every mile, Caleb felt like he was moving further and further away from the life he had known. The quiet, lonely life of a rancher was gone. He was something else now, a guardian, a protector, and a target. They reached the line shack just as the sun was setting. It was little more than a one-room cabin tucked into a grove of aspens, but it was defensible, and it was hidden. He carried Ellen inside and laid her on the dusty cot, the girls huddled by the cold fireplace, clutching their doll. Ellen opened her eyes. They were clear, the fever gone. "Where are we?" she whispered. "Safe," he said, "for now." She looked at him, her gaze searching his face. "Why are you doing this, Caleb? You don't even know me." Caleb looked at her two daughters, their faces illuminated by the last rays of sunlight coming through the dirty window. "I know enough," he said. He went back outside to stand watch. The wind whispered through the aspens, sounding like voices. He knew Hart would be coming. Larson's men would be scouring the countryside for them. He had bought them a little time, but time was running out, and he was alone, miles from anywhere, with a wounded woman, two small children, and an army of killers on his trail. He checked the shotgun, his face a grim mask in the fading light. Let them come. The first day at the shack was a blur of survival. Caleb worked tirelessly, his hands, once used for mending fences, now tasked with fortifying their refuge. He patched the holes in the cabin walls with mud and grass. He found a small spring nearby and hauled bucket after bucket of fresh water. He set snares in the woods, his old tracking skills coming back to him as if he'd used them only yesterday. By nightfall, he had caught 2 rabbits, and the smell of roasting meat filled the small cabin, a welcome change from the scent of fear and sickness. The girls watched him, their initial terror slowly being replaced by a quiet curiosity. He carved another small animal for the younger one, a little wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. She took it from his large, calloused hand, her small fingers tracing the rough edges. A tiny smile touched her lips for the first time. Ellen was getting stronger, the color was returning to her cheeks, and she was able to sit up for a few minutes at a time. She watched him as he moved about the cabin, his presence filling the small space. He was a quiet man, speaking only when necessary, but there was a steadiness to him that was more reassuring than any words. That night, as the girls slept soundly for the first time in days, she finally told him her story. Her husband wasn't just a man named Larson, he was Judge Larson, the most powerful man in the territory. He presented a face of law and order to the world, but in private he was a monster. He didn't just rule the county, she said, her voice a low, trembling whisper. He owned it, and everything in it, including me. She told him how she had finally found the courage to leave, not for herself, but for her daughters. She couldn't let them grow up in that house of horrors. But she didn't just run, she took something with her. He keeps a ledger, she explained, her eyes dark with the memory. A record of all his real business, the bribes, the extortion, the men he's had killed. It's all in there. She had stolen the ledger, hoping to use it to expose him, to buy her freedom, but his men, led by Hart, had caught up with her on the trail. They'd run her wagon off the road, and in the chaos she'd been stabbed. She managed to escape with the girls, hiding them in the hollow tree just before she collapsed. The ledger, Caleb said, his voice tight. Where is it? Ellen's eyes flicked to the raggedy doll the older girl, Sarah, clutched even in her sleep. It's not a book, she whispered. It's smaller. I sewed it into the doll's lining. Caleb stared at the doll, a simple child's toy, now the most dangerous object in the territory. It was proof. It was a death sentence. And it was sitting in a cabin with a leaking roof, miles from the nearest town, guarded by one man with a shotgun. He'll never stop looking for it, Ellen said, her voice filled with despair. He'll tear this whole country apart to get it back. Let him try, Caleb said, his voice a low growl. He felt a cold fury building inside him. It wasn't just about protecting a woman and her children anymore, it was about justice. It was about tearing down a man like Larson who hid behind a badge and a black robe while he destroyed innocent lives. The next 2 days passed in a tense quiet. Caleb scouted the surrounding area, learning the trails, the hiding places, the lay of the land. He was no longer a rancher. He was a hunter again. The skills he'd tried to bury years ago, now his only asset. He knew they couldn't stay in the shack forever. Larson's men were like wolves. They would cast a wider and wider net until they found them. He had to make a move. He had to go on the offensive. On the third night, he saw it. A single campfire far down in the valley. A search party. They were getting closer. He went back to the cabin. Ellen was awake, her face pale in the moonlight. They're here, aren't they? She asked. He nodded. One camp, about 5 miles south. What are we going to do? She whispered, her hand instinctively going to her daughters, sleeping peacefully on their makeshift bed. Caleb picked up the shotgun. He checked the shells, his movements deliberate and precise. You're going to stay here and keep the door barred. You don't open it for anyone but me, he said. Where are you going? She asked, her eyes wide with fear. He looked at her, his face set like stone. I'm going hunting. He slipped out of the cabin and melted into the trees. A ghost in the darkness. He wasn't running anymore. He was a man with a past he had tried to escape by living a quiet life. But men like Larson, men like Hart, they didn't believe in quiet lives. They believed in power, and in taking whatever they wanted. They had taken this family's peace, they had tried to take their lives, and now they had woken something in Caleb that had been dormant for a long, long time. The rancher was gone. The man who was walking through the woods that night was someone else entirely. And he was going to make them pay. He moved through the forest with a silence born of long practice. The moon was a sliver of light, casting long, dancing shadows through the pines. He could smell their campfire long before he saw it, the scent of wood smoke and coffee sharp on the night air. He crept to the edge of the clearing and watched. There were 4 of them, huddled around the fire, their rifles leaning against a log. Hart was not among them. These were just hired guns, men who would kill for a few dollars, their faces hard and empty. Caleb felt a familiar disgust. He had known men like this his whole life. They were a disease on the land. He circled the camp, a patient predator, learning their positions, their watch schedule. There was none. They were arrogant, confident that their prey was a helpless woman and 2 children. They weren't expecting a wolf to be guarding the sheep. He waited until the dead of night, when the fire had burned down to embers and the men were asleep, wrapped in their bedrolls. He took out the 4 men with a brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold. He didn't use the shotgun. The noise would carry for miles. He used his knife and his hands, moving from one sleeping figure to the next, a phantom of vengeance in the darkness. It was a grim, ugly business, but he felt no remorse. These men had chosen their side. They had hunted a mother and her children. They had forfeited any right to mercy. He left one man alive, but barely. He tied him to a tree, his hands bound tight behind him. When the man came to, his eyes wide with terror, Caleb was standing over him, his face a mask of cold fury in the pre-dawn light. You're going to take a message back to your boss, Caleb said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. You tell Hart and you tell Judge Larson that they need to leave this family alone. You tell them if I see any of their men within 20 miles of this mountain again, I'll do to them what I did to your friends. You tell them the rancher is done running. He cut the man's bonds. Now get out of here. The man scrambled to his feet and ran, crashing through the underbrush like a panicked deer. Caleb watched him go, then methodically erased any sign of the struggle, burying the bodies deep in the forest. He took their rifles, their ammunition, and a small bag of supplies. War had come to his mountain, and he was now armed for it. He returned to the cabin as the sun was rising. Ellen was waiting at the door, her face etched with worry. When she saw him, the rifles slung over his shoulder, a look of understanding and something like fear crossed her face. "It's done," he said simply, walking past her into the cabin. He didn't tell her the details. He didn't need to. She knew what kind of man could walk into the woods at night and come back with 4 extra rifles. The girls were still asleep. He sat at the small table, cleaning the rifles with a steady hand. The quiet, gentle man who had carved them wooden toys was gone. In his place was a hard, dangerous stranger. Ellen sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. "Who are you, Caleb?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped his work and looked at her, his eyes seeming to look right through her. "I was a U.S. Marshal," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "For 10 years, I saw too much, did too much. I put away men like Larson, and I buried the ones who wouldn't be put away. One day I just walked away. Thought I could leave it all behind, start over, be a man of peace." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Looks like a man can't outrun what he is." The revelation hung in the air between them. It explained everything: his skill, his silence, his refusal to back down. He wasn't just a rancher who got caught up in something. He was a lawman, a warrior who had been pulled back into the one life he had tried so desperately to escape. "So what now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Now we fight," he said, sliding a shell into the chamber of one of the rifles. "I sent them a message, but a man like Larson doesn't listen to messages. He only understands one thing." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the vast, empty wilderness. "He'll send Hart, and he'll send everyone he has. They won't be coming to talk. They'll be coming to burn this cabin to the ground and bury us with it." He turned back to her, his face grim. "But this time, we'll be ready for them." The line shack was no longer a refuge, it was a fortress, and the siege was about to begin. The next few days were a blur of grim preparation. Caleb taught Ellen how to load and fire one of the rifles. Her hands shook at first, the weapon heavy and unfamiliar, but her jaw was set with a fierce determination. She would not be a victim again. He showed her how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. The first time she fired it, the sound cracked through the quiet forest, and the recoil sent her stumbling back. But she didn't drop it. She cocked it again, her eyes blazing. The girls, Sarah and Emily, learned to be quiet, to move like little shadows. They helped gather firewood and carry water, their small faces serious. The fear was still in their eyes, but now it was mixed with something else, a fierce, protective love for the 2 adults who were fighting for them. Caleb worked relentlessly, turning the small clearing into a death trap. He dug pits and filled them with sharpened stakes, covering them with a thin layer of branches and leaves. He set tripwires connected to stacks of logs, ready to come crashing down on anyone who stumbled through them. He used the land itself as a weapon, memorizing every rock, every tree, every gully that could be used for cover or ambush. He was a ghost in his own forest, preparing a welcome party for the men who were coming to kill them. He knew they were coming. He could feel it in the air, in the unnatural silence of the woods. The birds had gone quiet, the deer had moved to higher ground, the mountain was holding its breath. On the 4th morning he saw them, a dozen riders, moving slowly up the trail from the valley below. They were spread out, moving with a cautious professionalism that told Caleb these were not the same hired guns he had dealt with before. And at their head, on a big black horse, was Hart. Caleb watched them from a high ridge, his face impassive. A dozen men, against one man, a wounded woman, and 2 children. The odds were not good, but Caleb had faced worse odds before. He slipped back to the cabin, his movements silent and urgent. "They're here," he said, his voice low. Ellen's face went pale, but she picked up her rifle, her knuckles white. "Get the girls in the cellar," he ordered. The cabin had a small root cellar, little more than a hole in the ground, but it was the safest place for them. Sarah took her little sister's hand. "It's just a game, Emily," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We're going to hide, and Mama and Caleb will find us." Caleb barred the cellar door from the outside, then took his position by the window. Ellen stood at the window on the other side of the cabin. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sound was the wind in the pines and the frantic beating of their own hearts. Then they heard it, the soft crunch of a boot on a pine needle, the jingle of a bridle. They were here. Caleb saw the first man step into the clearing. He was moving cautiously, his rifle at the ready. Another man appeared on his flank, and another. They were surrounding the cabin just as he knew they would. He waited. He let them get closer. He let their confidence grow. He needed them all in the clearing. Hart's voice cut through the silence. "Larson knows you're in there, Marshal," he yelled. "He says to give him the doll and the woman, and he'll let you walk away." Caleb didn't answer. He just raised his rifle, the stock cool and smooth against his cheek. He sighted on the man closest to one of his traps. "He's lying, you know," Hart's voice called out again, laced with a cruel amusement. "He's not going to let any of you walk away. He's going to make an example of you." Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. He wasn't aiming at the man. He was aiming at the tripwire just behind him. He fired. The shot echoed through the clearing like a thunderclap. The man spun around, confused, and then the world exploded. The tripwire snapped, and a massive deadfall of logs and rocks came crashing down from the trees above, burying two of Hart's men in an avalanche of splintered wood and stone. The other men opened fire, their bullets ripping through the thin walls of the cabin. Splinters flew through the air like angry bees. Caleb and Ellen dropped to the floor, the roar of the gunfire deafening. "Now!" Caleb yelled over the noise. They both came up firing, not wildly, but with a cold, calculated precision. Caleb took down a man trying to take cover behind a tree. Ellen's shot went wide, but it was enough to make another man dive for cover, right into one of the pits Caleb had dug. The man's scream was short and terrible. The clearing became a whirlwind of smoke, gunfire, and chaos. Hart's men were disorganized, panicked. They had expected a simple execution, not a pitched battle. Caleb moved from window to window, a deadly blur of motion, his shots finding their mark with grim accuracy. He was no longer a rancher. He was the marshal again, a force of righteous fury unleashed. Hart, seeing his men falling around him, screamed in rage and charged the cabin, firing his pistol wildly. A bullet tore through Caleb's sleeve, grazing his arm. He grunted in pain but didn't falter. He met Hart's charge at the door, kicking it open and tackling the bigger man, sending them both tumbling out into the dirt. They rolled on the ground, a desperate, brutal tangle of fists and knives. Hart was strong, fueled by a vicious rage, but Caleb was smarter, more experienced. He twisted out of Hart's grip, grabbing a handful of dirt and flinging it into the other man's eyes. Hart roared in pain, momentarily blinded, and Caleb seized the advantage. He brought the butt of his pistol down hard on Hart's temple. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The gunfire had stopped. Silence descended on the clearing, broken only by the groans of the wounded. Caleb stood up, breathing heavily, his arm bleeding freely. He looked around at the carnage. 4 of Hart's men were dead. 3 more were wounded. The rest had fled into the woods. He had won. They had survived. But he knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that this was just the beginning. Larson would not take this defeat lying down. He would send more men. An army, if he had to. He would burn the whole mountain to get what he wanted. They had won the battle, but the war for their lives had just begun. He patched his arm with a strip torn from his shirt, the pain a dull throb. Ellen emerged from the cabin, her face smudged with gunpowder, her eyes wide. She looked at the scene of destruction, at the bodies of the men who had come to kill them, and a shudder ran through her. Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No," Caleb said, his voice grim. "It's just getting started." He knew they couldn't stay here. Hart would wake up, the survivors would regroup, and Larson would unleash his full fury. They had to move, and they had to move now. He pulled Hart's unconscious body into the cabin and tied him securely to a chair. The man would be his insurance policy, his bargaining chip. He let the girls out of the cellar. They clung to their mother, their eyes taking in the broken door and the bullet-riddled walls. "We played the hiding game, Mama," Emily said, her voice small. "Did we win?" Ellen hugged them tight, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, baby," she whispered into their hair. "We won." Caleb gathered what they could carry, the remaining ammunition, a little food, the blankets. He looked at the doll, still clutched in Sarah's hand. That little scrap of cloth and stuffing held the key to everything. It was their only hope, and their greatest danger. "We have to go," he said. "We can't go down the mountain. They'll be watching the trails. We have to go up. Over the top." It was a grueling climb. The terrain was steep and treacherous, the air thin and cold. Caleb led the way, carrying Emily on his shoulders, his wounded arm aching with every step. Ellen followed, holding Sarah's hand, her face a mask of exhaustion and determination. They climbed for hours, pushing themselves past the point of endurance, driven by the knowledge that to stop was to die. They finally made camp in a small hidden cave just below the summit as darkness fell. They were cold, hungry, and exhausted, but they were alive, and they were free. For now. Back in the valley, Judge Larson sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. His empire was built on fear and control. But now, for the first time in years, something was out of his control. A simple rancher, a ghost from the past, had defied him, had humiliated him. The man he had sent to retrieve his property had returned, battered and broken, with the tale of a demon on the mountain. Larson's face was a thundercloud of rage. He had underestimated Caleb. A fatal mistake. He would not make it again. He sent out riders to every town, every ranch, every outpost in the territory. The poster promised a $5,000 reward for the capture of the former U.S. Marshal, Caleb Hart, wanted for kidnapping and the murder of 4 deputies. He twisted the law to suit his needs, turning the hero into a villain, the protector into a criminal. In the cave, Caleb listened to the wind howling outside. He knew what Larson would be doing. He was turning the whole territory against them. They were no longer just fugitives. They were outlaws, hunted, with a price on their heads. There was nowhere left to run. "What do we do now, Caleb?" Ellen asked, her voice quiet in the darkness. "There's no place to hide." Caleb looked at her, at the 2 small girls sleeping fitfully beside the fire. He had tried to leave the law behind him, but the law, in its most twisted and corrupt form, had found him. He couldn't run from it. He couldn't hide from it. He had to face it. "We don't hide," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound resolve. "We take the fight to him." Ellen stared at him. "How? He's a judge. He has an army of men. We're alone." "We have the truth," Caleb said, nodding toward the doll. "And sometimes that's the only army you need." He had a plan. It was desperate. It was reckless. It was probably suicidal. But it was their only chance. "The territorial governor is coming to town in 2 days," he said. "He's making a speech at the new courthouse. Larson will be there, right on the stage next to him, looking like a pillar of the community." He looked at Ellen, his eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen before. "And that's where we're going to deliver his ledger. Right into the governor's hands, in front of the whole town." It was a crazy plan, to walk back into the lion's den, into the town that wanted them dead, to face the man who had tried to kill them on his own ground. But looking at Caleb's face, at the unwavering conviction in his eyes, Ellen knew they had no other choice. They would stop running, they would turn and face the monster, and they would either win their freedom or die trying. The journey back down the mountain was even more perilous than the climb up. They had to travel at night, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the patrols that Larson had sent out to scour the countryside. The wanted posters were everywhere, nailed to trees, tacked to the walls of barns. Caleb's face, grim and weathered, stared out from the cheap paper, the word murderer stamped across it in bold black letters. Every person they saw was a potential enemy, every distant shout a potential threat. They were ghosts in their own land, hunted and despised. They finally reached the outskirts of town on the morning the governor was due to arrive. The town was buzzing with activity. Banners hung from the buildings, and a speaker's platform had been erected in front of the courthouse. The whole territory seemed to have turned out for the event. And everywhere there were Larson's men. They stood on street corners, on rooftops, their rifles held at the ready. The town was an armed camp. Caleb found a hiding place in an abandoned stable at the edge of town. "You wait here," he told Ellen. "I'll go in. I'll find a way to get to the governor." "No," she said, her voice firm. "We do this together. It was my fight to begin with. I'm not going to hide while you risk your life for us." He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, and he knew he couldn't argue. They were in this together, to the end. They waited until the town square was packed with people, all craning their necks to get a glimpse of the governor. Larson was on the platform, looking smug and powerful, the very picture of justice and authority. Caleb and Ellen slipped into the crowd, their faces hidden by the brims of their hats. The girls were with them, holding tight to their mother's hands, their faces pale and scared. It was a terrible risk to bring them, but they couldn't leave them behind. The governor began to speak, his voice booming out over the crowd. Caleb scanned the platform, the surrounding rooftops, planning his approach. There were too many guards. A direct assault was impossible. He needed a diversion, and then he saw it. The blacksmith's wife was in the crowd, not far from them. She caught his eye and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She had not forgotten them. Caleb slipped a small folded note into her hand as he passed. "Get this to the governor's aide," he whispered. "Tell him it's a matter of life and death." The woman nodded again, her face grim, and disappeared into the crowd. The governor was finishing his speech. It was now or never. Caleb looked at Ellen. "Ready?" he asked. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." They started moving through the crowd, a single determined unit. People jostled them, pushed them, but they kept moving forward, their eyes locked on the platform. They were 20 feet away when one of the guards spotted them. "It's Hart," he yelled, pointing. "He's here." The crowd erupted in panic. People screamed and scattered. The guards raised their rifles. Larson's face, which had been a mask of civic pride, contorted into a snarl of pure hatred. "Shoot them," he screamed. "Shoot them all." But just as the guards took aim, a new voice cut through the chaos. "Hold your fire!" It was the governor's aide, standing on the steps of the platform, the note from Caleb clutched in his hand. "The governor will see them." Larson's face went white. He had lost control. The crowd parted, creating a path for Caleb, Ellen, and the girls. They walked up the steps of the platform, the eyes of the entire town upon them. They were no longer hiding. They stood before the governor, a battered, exhausted family who had been to hell and back. Sarah, her small face solemn, stepped forward and held out the raggedy doll. "My mama said you need to see this," she said, her voice clear and strong. The governor, a stern-faced man with intelligent eyes, took the doll. He looked from the child to Larson, whose face was now slick with sweat. With a small knife, the governor's aide slit the seam in the doll's back. A small leather-bound book fell out. The governor picked it up and opened it. He began to read. The silence in the square was absolute. As he turned the pages, a look of utter disgust spread across the governor's face. He looked up, his eyes like chips of ice, and fixed them on Judge Larson. "Judge," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "you are a disgrace to this territory. You are a cancer that has been allowed to grow for too long." He turned to his men. "Arrest this man," he said, his voice booming across the square. "Arrest him for corruption, for extortion, and for murder." Larson was stunned. He looked around wildly, but his men, the men who had been so loyal when he held the power, now refused to meet his eyes. They stepped back, letting the governor's marshals take him. The reign of terror was over. The crowd, which had been so ready to see Caleb hang, now erupted in cheers. They surged forward, surrounding Caleb and Ellen, clapping them on the back, shaking their hands. They had not known the truth, but now they did, and they were celebrating their liberation. Caleb stood there, his arm around Ellen and the girls, and watched as the man who had tried to destroy them was led away in chains. The fight was over. They had won. A few days later, they stood on the porch of Caleb's ranch house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of red and gold. The governor had cleared Caleb's name, restoring his reputation and thanking him for his service to the territory. He had even offered him his old job back. But Caleb had refused. His life as a marshal was over, for good this time. He had found something else to fight for, something to build instead of tear down. Ellen came and stood beside him, her hand finding his. "It's quiet here," she said, her voice soft. "Quiet's good," he answered. The girls were chasing butterflies in the yard, their laughter echoing in the peaceful evening air. The sound was sweeter than any music he had ever heard. He looked at his ranch, at the windmill turning slowly in the breeze, at the fences that stretched out to the horizon. It was the same place he had lived for years, but it felt different now. It felt like home. He had spent so long running from his past, trying to be someone he wasn't. But by embracing who he was, by standing up for those who couldn't stand for themselves, he had found a peace he never thought possible. He had ridden out that morning a lonely rancher, a man on the edges of life. He was returning a hero, a father, a partner. He had faced down a corrupt judge and his army of killers. He had saved a family and liberated a town. He had looked into the abyss and had not flinched. He pulled Ellen closer, the warmth of her body a comfort against his. The past was behind them. The future was an open prairie, full of possibility. And for the first time in a very long time, Caleb wasn't afraid to ride into it. What city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.